Hi, everybody. Welcome again to another episode of the ShopNotes podcast. I'm your host, Phil Huber. Today, I'm joined by design editor Dillon Baker on a special spring break podcast. Shout out to Epilogue Laser, the sponsors of today's episode. You can quickly and easily customize your woodworking projects for added beauty and value. Learn more at epiloguelaser.com. All right, so we have John and Logan are both on spring break a little bit. Logan's on a working spring break where he's down with Doug Stowe, the box maker extraordinaire in Arkansas, doing some photos. So I brought in Dillon Baker to talk about some stuff that's going on in the shop and his perspective on things. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was finishing.
A very, very important part of woodworking that many people dread.
Right.
Akin to sanding.
Well, I think, and I think what the two things that brought it up are, you just recently did a ridiculous number of tables, and also the bookcase project that you did kind of some final spray coats on. So I was wondering maybe if you would just kind of run through. I mean, I know every project has its own uniqueness to it, but like, what's your standard finish process?
Sure. Well, like many of the projects, typically we're doing, I feel like more times than not, if we're staining stuff here, we're usually using a gel stain or an oil-based stain, more or less just for their ease of use. And plus, like anything, it's just really easy to get in a routine of just kind of using what you know, and we are guilty of that here at the magazine. Gel stains, oil stains, a lot of time. I mean, sanding that I kind of alluded to earlier is obviously a very important yet sometimes dreaded task in woodworking, just because it does take incredible amount of time, or can, depending on what shape your piece is in when you're done working on it, we use a lot of power tools here. And that's not always the standard. There are people that have a reverence or just prefer to use hand tools. It's kind of similar to turning. You would rather scrape than sand. And so, if you're using very sharp hand tools, a lot of times the individuals that use those, they can get them pretty much to a finished quality by just using hand tools, and really we'll just go back and maybe use some 120, 150. Again, it just kind of depends on the finish you're using or the aesthetic or look you're going for. But typically here, sanding for me starts at 100 and goes to 150 almost always. If I'm doing like Phil talked about, a bunch of tabletops, I don't really pay as close attention to the bottom. I still want them to look nice, but they're not going to receive the same type of attention that the tops would, which for good reason. But like I said, usually 100 to about 150 grit, just making sure I'm going over in both directions with the grain, against the grain. And then usually I like to blow off my pieces no matter what with an air compressor, and then I'll even wipe them back with like a tack cloth. I'm using stain. Stain is definitely the next step. After that dries for 24, 48 hours, I'm usually going straight to the finish, and we typically use a catalyzed lacquer here. I just finished using some post-catalyzed stuff, which has a shorter pot life but can be a lot more durable, hence why I use it on tables for a restaurant, which that requires you to mix it yourself. Pre-cat stuff usually comes pre-catalyzed at your local either home improvement store or woodworking store or whatever those finishes are provided. So I usually do 2 coats of that stuff, 3 if necessary, but typically I can get it into pretty well. And that application is very similar to the staining and sanding process, where I will actually go against the grain and then with the grain to finish off. And then once that's dried, the catalyzed stuff dries a lot quicker. So you can usually sand stuff. I usually wait 45 minutes to an hour, sometimes longer. and that stuff sands really beautifully. Um, I use about a 320 or typically a 400 grit, and I just want to make sure I get really good, especially on the first coat. I just want to get kind of I'm trying to think of the adjective used to describe. It sands and you kind of get like almost like a chalky dust on there, and I just want to make sure I'm kind of consistently getting that all over because again, your base coat is arguably one of your most important coats, as you only really
Right.
have number 2 or 3. So I use that, and then I what I'll usually blow that off too with an airbrush just to get any sort of debris or dirt off, and then I use a lot of times I'll just use like a tap cloth to get the remainder off, and then I'm spraying the second coat on. Some people will put it on a little thicker than the first. I usually just kind of stick with the same as the first. I just want to make sure I get really good coverage, and I just sand really well after that first coat. And that's really what I'm used to. Again, I've just been using the catalyzed stuff for so long here for the magazine, and then I've used the post-cat stuff for a lot of commercial use stuff just because it holds up really well. It's a little more durable. It goes on a little thicker too, but it sprays
Okay.
pretty much the same. So, yeah.
So now a couple of questions here following up is when you have a project that's been stained, like that bookcase that we just wrapped up, how do you still sand after the first coat of finish, and how are you avoiding burning through stain?
That's a great question. Some people will do. You can use or apply a first coat of finish almost like a sanding sealer on top of the finish. I know that I believe did you use tongue oil on top of the finish on the case?
Yeah, it was like tongue oil varnished. Yeah.
Yeah, which that really helps because I would never sand the finish itself without any sort of coat on top of that, whether it's a sealer like a tongue oil, or even if you're just using your first coat of lacquer, like a really thin coat just to kind of lock in the stain. Because even after a first coat of finish, you've got to be careful to not, especially around edges too, where the stain doesn't really hold as well. It's really easy to knock it back to the finish. So, a lot of that just has to do with pressure. Again, make sure you're using like a 400 or higher in between. That will help alleviate from that too. But I would probably never sand a stain without a sealer on top of it because you will run that risk. You can do it if you want to try it. I just don't really recommend it because you'll find yourself removing the material on ingrain and edges more frequently than not.
Sure. Well, and that's what I was wondering is like, have you ever done like say 2 coats of lacquer before sanding because it's been stained in order to avoid a burn through? Or are you to the point where, like you can do one coat of clear and then be fine, confident knowing that you're, providing you're not like being real aggressive because you're just knocking back dust nibs. You're not trying to sand out imperfections at that point.
Right. I guess I've been doing it. I don't want to say long enough as if I've had this, 10-year career finishing woodworking projects, but I'm usually confident enough in my first coat with even like wipe on poly and especially spray stuff that, pending that your gun's working the way you want. I'm usually kind of a stickler about having the gun cleaned out. A lot of times I'll run lacquer through the line in the pot, and then I'll put my lacquer back in there. I usually soak my tips in lacquer thinner when I'm not using them. And so again, just ensuring that your fan is appropriate and the volume of material coming through. I mean, I check all that stuff before. So again, it's just kind of a built-in I don't want to say proficiency, but again, just a sort of confidence in what I'm doing that I'm just getting a good enough coverage on the first coat that I know I'm not going to go through it. I'm still cautious around ingrain and edges for sure. But on the surface, it's really never much of an issue because again, I'm still going across the grain and then with the grain always on all my coats. So I'm not overly liberal with the first coat, but I'm definitely not conservative with it either. So
yeah. So when you're sanding, are you using a block then with it, or is it just, because a lot of times, and I am not a professional spray finisher by any means. I just have a small piece of, 400 sandpaper that I've just kind of tri-folded, and it's maybe, 2 by 2 inches square, and I'm just kind of using finger pressure on it. Are you using a block to back it up, or just hand pressure?
I more times am not. I usually just use my hand, and I'm just knocking back all the nibs from the, just if it's an inconsistency in air pressure, it's usually just inevitable on a first coat anyway, because you're fighting whatever your finish coat you have on anyway. So if you're only sanding to a 120, 150, it's not overly coarse, but again, there's still going to be some imperfections and some uh, uh, parts of the grain that are raised more than others that you're going to collect those, again, nibs and stuff from the first coat. But preferably, I like using a wood block with a like a cork backing on it. I even
Yeah.
really like the pre-made, like a lot of people make them, but the 3M sanding pads are really nice too, just to get a really like consistent kind of sanding pattern on it too. And I'd probably be more apt to use those if I was doing multiple coats of finish where you're going up in your grit. So if I say I use 400 pretty much exclusively. If I was doing like a third or fourth coat, I'd probably bump up to like a 600. I know Dana, our old shop manager, he used to even go up to like 1200 sometimes if he was doing multiple
Wow.
coats of stuff, which you could argue that that's excessive, but again, it just depends on the type of finish that you want you're trying to achieve. Or again, a lot of people just do stuff out of just doing the same thing all the time. So, um, but yeah, 400, 600, I think is a pretty good uh, grit, couple of grits to start in terms of finish. And again, if you're doing more than two, you might want to consider using something that allows you to have a little bit more of a consistent uh, footprint when you're sanding. But yeah, I more times than not, I'm just folding over my 8.5 by 11 sheets and just using my hand lightly.
Yeah. So, that was one thing when I first started using the spray equipment here is you spray that first coat on and wait your hour and a half to make sure that it's dry, and then you run your hand over it. And it's kind of surprising on how scratchy that feels.
Hmm.
And then, you sand it flat, and then you put the second coat on, and it's ridiculous how smooth that second coat is after that.
Yeah, it makes a world of difference. And I think part of that too has to do with, depending on how you remove the debris after you're sanding your first coat. I think even if you use an airbrush or a tack cloth or whatever your method is, inevitably some of that is going to kind of embed into any sort of like graining that may have protruded.
Oh,
Again, short of like sanding down to some ridiculous grit or using a sanding sealer, which people already do just so they can ensure a dead flat finish. Um, it almost kind of acts in your favor because I mean lacquer just it covers up anything. You can see all the scratches and imperfections from sanding in between coats, but it's pretty amazing how much life it really gives on even after the first coat, but certainly the second coat where it becomes um, it certainly brightens the stain you used, but it fills in any sort of voids and stuff, or does a really good job of kind of concealing that.
yeah. Which is what I was kind of surprised on the that bookcase project, because that was one that we did on the TV show, and so our surface prep prior to staining wasn't stellar,
Sure.
but the final result after just a couple of coats of lacquer over the top, it was. I mean, it's an impressive looking piece of furniture now.
Yeah, it really makes a world of difference. And even some of the, some of the areas that may not have, gotten as much of attention because of the nature of, how that project was put together for the show. Those are things that can end up being knocked back to because you guys did the tung oil on top as, again, kind of like a sealer. And
Yeah,
it makes a world of difference. The other thing too, if you're finding yourself not 100% confidence in even your staining ability, there are opportunities post stain to kind of fix any sort of blemishes. I've done this time and time again where I've actually tinted lacquer, to give a little bit more of a uniform color if I'm seeing there's an inconsistency in where there are certain areas of the wood that absorb the stain more than others, or again, I didn't maybe sand as well in an area that I probably should have. Again, so there's definitely other remedies you can do to offset, again, sort of any inconsistencies in your staining process, which is a huge relief because we all know you spend enough time building your project, you get into that final stretch where you have to stain and spray finish or apply finish with a brush or a rag. So it's reassuring to know that there's other things that you can do.
Yeah, because I think there's a little bit of a fear factor in finishing, because I think a lot of woodworkers, because we do the woodworking part of it so often and so repetitively, that there is a confidence in, knowing that our joinery is going to be tight or what to do if it's not, and whatever. But once you get to the finishing, because you're only, a given piece might have a dozen or more mortise and tenon joints in it, but you've only finished it once. Mm-hmm. So you don't have that same kind of built up practice in the finishing process. So there's a little bit more of an intimidation factor, I think.
Yeah. And again, that's just something that comes with experience and time and obviously a lot of patience. But yeah, there's usually always a fix for something that you conceive as being just a complete blunder. And once you become more seasoned as a woodworker, you realize that it seems like 80% of being a woodworker is just figuring out how to solve problems that you've created for yourself, because you have this, sort of exacting idea of how things should be, because you're used to just seeing beauty shots in a magazine. Well, I'll be the first to tell you that a lot of those projects weren't perfect. It's just a lot of time and practice, and obviously a little bit of Photoshop too, and color correction.
Yeah.
We're all guilty of it.
Right. Well, I was thinking, not everybody's going to have a spray set up, but I think it pays to get to know a local paint store, because they're going to have, because you can find tinted lacquer in spray cans that you can use to touch up a project. I think it's usually called toner at that point.
Yeah. Mohawk, I think, is that the brand that we get?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That stuff works really well for small projects. I mean, I probably wouldn't want to spray a full-size cabinet with 20 aerosol cans, but it's definitely a good introduction into how that stuff applies, and then how to treat it in between coats. And certainly the fan on that is going to be different than what it's like on an HVLP gun or even a gravity. But again, at least you have an idea of what that stuff starts to look like on stain or on bare wood, and then again the treatment in between those coats. So yeah, you're right. You don't have to have a commercial spray booth, which is a great asset for us to have. I know there's a lot of portable ones that are available now too. You don't have to go out and spend a bunch of money on a gun. I mean, there's a lot of stuff available at home improvement stores or your local paint store that you can get for what I consider fairly reasonable price. If you're someone that's going to be doing it a lot, I think it's definitely worth the investment. Now, if you're just a hobbyist, maybe not, but again.
Yeah. Today's episode is brought to you by Epilog Laser. Quickly and easily customize your woodworking projects for added beauty and value. Learn more at epiloglaser.com. Yeah. Well, one thing that I wanted to, before we jump into that, I wanted to just back up a little bit.
Sure.
Because there's a little bit of controversy maybe in the shop. Because you had talked about, in between coats where you're going to wipe down your project, you use a tack cloth. Mm-hmm. Whereas Steve and Mark aren't really tack cloth kind of people.
Yeah.
And I've even heard people question or send in questions about, whether a tack cloth is going to leave residue behind that's going to affect the subsequent coats of finish and blah, blah, blah. But you stand by your tack cloth use.
Yeah, I don't know if I would use it on top of like just bare stain. So after you finish staining something before you finish, I don't use them exclusively. Actually, I know they use these like cotton rags a lot too. We were buying cotton rags, and then Mark started buying. I don't know if you remember, Phil, what the name of they're like Scott or Scotch or.
Oh yeah, the Scott. Yeah,
Scott brand of they basically just look like thicker paper towels.
Right.
And those work fine too. I just sand enough in between on the second coat that I just feel, if I'm not using an airbrush in conjunction with or in tandem with, I tend to use the tack cloth. But I've never really had much of an issue with it leaving residue. I feel like you'd really have to apply a lot of pressure, and I'm basically using those like sandpaper where I'm just lightly dragging it across the surface. There's enough tack to them where it really pulls up any residual or dust.
Yeah.
And then I'll air hose after that even. But yeah, I suppose I could see it running into problems with bare stain, but unless your lacquer, your finish isn't cured, that would be an issue too.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the other thing is because I like using a tack cloth just because I feel like I'm really able to see the progress as the fact that it's pulling up stuff.
Yeah.
But, and you're not using a tack cloth like an eraser, where you're rubbing hard on your piece. You're just kind of dragging it across. Yeah. And I think that's where, if you're going to get residue, it's if you're scrubbing your piece with a tack cloth rather than just wiping it.
Yeah, and I not really don't want to put words in their mouths, but I think for some people it just becomes a point of kind of irritation too, where it's a tack cloth, so it's tacky, so it's just like sticking to your hands, and it's sticking to your clothes, and it's just picking up all of these particles of dust everywhere, and yeah, I don't know. Again, I think it kind of just falls into the category of what you're used to. Some people use something once and they never want to touch it again. But again, back to your point, like I don't use a tack cloth all the time. It's just a resource that we have, and I find it useful, especially when I was doing all those tables. I was just hyper aware of what those were going to look like in the end, even though they're in a bar setting now and probably destroyed. But it nevertheless. I'm the one that has to live with myself when I'm done with them, so that's all that really matters.
Yeah. Right. So now, like in our shop, we have, we've talked about the commercial spray setup where we have it on plumbed compressed air. It's a compressed air system. But we also have used in the shop is the Earlex 5500.
Yeah. I think it's the smaller one.
And I know you've used that a number of times as well. Could you kind of compare a little bit how they're either different or, and then maybe wrap it up with the fact that would you recommend that if somebody that isn't going to be able to put in a spray booth in their shop, garage, or whatever, is the Earlex going to be able to do something for you?
I don't remember how the Earlex is advertised. I have almost always used it to spray either milk paint, which a lot of the store-bought milk paint is essentially latex paint anyway, or latex paint itself. I have found with that you do need to cut your paint with water, and it's really just kind of a trial and error of how much you add. I almost think it's almost like half and half. It's quite a bit. It does not apply. It's not really capable of applying as thick of a coat, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. The pressure is a little different. It's runoff. It's electric. I think those are technically an HVLP as well, but they're not using compressed air. They're using electricity to generate the energy to push the air through the nozzle. I think you can get different nozzles for that. Obviously, if you're spraying paint, you want a larger nozzle. If you're spraying finish, you want a smaller one. I've actually never sprayed lacquer with it. I've only used paint with it. I was rather impressed with it when we first got it. I think it fell out of favor with me, probably just because it was starting to get neglected in terms of being cleaned out. So it wasn't really performing the way that it needed to. You find yourself holding the gun, a few inches away from your piece and moving at just a glacial pace to get a coat on, and that's obviously an issue. I think since then, technically it's Marks, but we have a Graco, which is a home. I think it's a home improvement brand paint sprayer that's used for spraying stain, painting houses. I used to use one for years for painting the exteriors of houses. Those are actually about the same price point, if I can remember correctly, and I think those do a lot better job. And I think there's a lot more versatility with the tip sizes you can get for those too. And those are easy because you just pull the tip out, where I think you actually have to get a whole new head for the Erlax. I don't quote me on that. But I've been using that to spray latex paint. It's actually quite incredible. It's kind of a pain to clean, and it requires quite a bit of paint to prime. You actually have to prime quite a bit of paint through the system in order to spray. So you're not really going to be using like a quart of paint to spray. Like you almost have to get a gallon of paint or finish to get it through the system enough to have enough pressure to spray. And those are also electric as well. But the Erlax, again, if you're someone that's just using it from time to time as a hobbyist, I think it's a good investment. And I'm pretty sure you can spray stain or finish with it too. I don't see why you couldn't. It would just be a matter of tip size, because there's really I don't think there's any regulator on that. You're kind of just stuck with one setting, where the Graco and even the Vilbliss that we have, which is a really nice HVLP gun, there's several different settings on there in terms of your fan size, the amount of material running through, and I think you can even adjust the PSI on the gun itself, even though we have a separate regulator for ours. And yeah, like Phil said, I think the Erlax is around, it might even be less than $400 now, because they do a step up that I think is closer to $600 or $700. And I used to share studio space with the guy that used that almost exclusively for spraying lacquer. And again, it wasn't that much more expensive. I mean, I look at those, it is a lot of money, but again, it just depends on how much you're going to use out of it. I think a lot of those things are just worth the investment if you're going to be spraying a lot. There's really no reason to compromise on your finished product. So, yeah. And I've seen guys even like, Philip Morley, who's kind of a darling of the Instagram world, but certainly someone that is a very good woodworker. I see him spray stuff outdoors all the time, if the weather permits. He lives down in Texas, so again, he's got a lot more consistent, nicer weather than we do here in the Midwest. But I see him spraying conversion varnish outside, even without like a hood around it. So again, I'm not using this as advice, but again, I think that there's, again, like a lot of things in woodworking, there's just a myth around a lot of the equipment you need to do certain things. And yeah, I've seen people use guns just outside without having an actual surround or fan or anything, as long as they're outdoors. So I kind of got off on a tangent there.
All right. Some good stuff on finishing and spray finishing. If you have any questions, comments, or smart remarks, I'd love to hear about it. Today's free plan that will kind of relates to what we've been talking about is a sanding block. And it's a shop-made one for either adhesive back paper or just regular sanding sheets. You can find the link for it on our show notes page at woodsmith.com/podcasts or on our YouTube channel. So special thanks to Epilogue Laser for sponsoring today's podcast. If you want to find out more about what you can do with an Epilogue Laser to customize your woodworking projects for added beauty and value, just check them out at epiloguelaser.com. Thanks. Bye.